Here we're going to talk about for loops. For loops are a great way to actually automate the creation of tables in HTML or anything that's going to be needed to be duplicated. It helps with databases. For and for each are two different statements. We'll talk about both of these. And while loops are also really good, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. But you can see here we have multiple boxes here that look the same. And then we have a different color box, and it's actually going to be printed out here 4 times. Let's take a look at the code. If we look at for loops inside about 45, the line number there, you're going to see the for statement, and you're going to have to enclose it in parentheses again. That's very important, otherwise it's not going to work. And then we have the curly brace. I often call it a bracket, but it really is a curly brace. That's the formal way of talking about it, a brace or curly brace. And let's see. What we need to do is have 3 different things here. I call them things, but there are 3 different little expressions in here that we need to take care of. And they're separated by semicolons like statements. Now when a for loop is executed, it's going to execute for the section of code over and over again as long as a condition is met. So I first has to be set to a value here, an initial value. And that's going to be 1. This variable is going to be local to this loop. It's a local variable to the loop. That's the scope. Now, oftentimes I, j, k, these are used specifically with your loops, your for loops. They're always incrementing things. You can use anything you want, but the word counter, for example, but most of the time you're using I, pretty standard. So we set that to a value of 1 to start it off. That's the beginning. Then it's a semicolon, space for clarity, and then we have $i is less than 5, which is the condition, the bound. As long as I is less than 5, we can do this over and over again. And to keep it from doing this forever, over and over again, we have an incrementer. And this is going to increment the value of I. $i plus plus just adds 1 to the value of I. It could be $i is equal to $i plus 1. It could also be minus minus. And that would be decrementing things, taking 1 off of I, going in the other direction. If we did that, then this would be an internal loop, infinite loop, because then I would never be greater than 5. We'll talk about that later. But what happens is, I starts at 1, it's incremented, and then it goes on to the next one. So what we'll do is, we're just going to echo out I. Just like that. And we'll cut that out of here actually. And we already have it there. That's where we're going to paste it. So I did that already. No problem. So what we do is, this is going to loop for the number of times that it's allowed to loop until it gets to the fact that I is actually 5 or greater. That's going to be the condition that's going to cause it to come out of this loop. So when we look at that, it should already be set here. I is equal to 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And you see it changes colors. The class here, the CSS is changing dynamically. But notice that we're changing the TD here. We're changing the table cell, not the table row. And that is going to go from left to right. It's straight HTML in there. You can look at the source code too for the HTML. And that's going to change that class and change the color. And it means that we're using the switch statement here to do that. We set the $class value here if I is equal to 1, 2, 3, or the default. The default will only occur if I is equal to 4, because 1, 2, and 3 are taken care of, and we have the break statements in there. So if I is 1, it breaks, leaves this point, comes down here, and then does this. If I is equal to 2, it first checks to see if I is equal to 1, then it tests for 2. It is 2, so it changes the class to table blue. The break causes it to break down here and then execute the next line of code, and there you see it. That's going to get executed with 2, and so on and so on. If it has to go to the 4th case, it will. And then that's the default, it'll be green. And we did that here, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how you do columns. You can also do rows. So after that first one, now we have J. Now as long as J is less than 4, and we start J off as 1, then we're going to add 1 to J for each time that we execute this loop until J is no longer less than 4. And what we do first is we create the table row, echo that out for HTML, and then we're going to do the whole class thing again. And in this example, I just have everything as gray. But we could change that to make it more presentable. We just want to make sure everything is going to be nice and clear for each example. And we'll refresh. And now you can see everything is matching to what we had before, but it's matching for each row because it's creating a whole new row and then doing the same thing over and over again. That's because we have this table row here. And then we do the same thing where we create the TDs here and output I as well. And then inside the loop, right before we go back to the loop again, we have to close out that tag. If we don't do that, we have problems. But luckily, Internet Explorer is very, very good about it, and it knows that that's the end of the table row. But if you look at the source code, and if you scroll down, you'll find that that doesn't necessarily do the right thing, as you can see here. And it's outputting nice, clean TDs here, nice, clean HTML, but there's no closing TR there. So, IE still has some good qualities there. Further down, we have another way to do this. A for loop, same thing, more spaces here, just for clarity. Here we have I is less than or equal to 6. And what it does is, the curly brace here, and then the curly brace here should be the ending one. All we do is put all of this code in here, and this is executed over and over again until I is greater than 6, because less than or equal to is going to allow it to continue. I is equal to 0. Okay, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then it's going to come up and be 7, and then it has to drop out. So I is incremented after the fact. It comes back up here, and then it increments I the next time around. And that's how it works always. And you can see that here. That's what it's doing. But we're creating whole little boxes here. Any HTML you want to create, you can do that. And you can see that it goes up to 6, and that's the last one. Now it's going to start executing the different colored ones, as you can see. And that's the last thing we're going to represent here. And we'll look at this later, but this is the for each. For each has a different syntax, as you can see. All we're doing is using an array, and this is going to allow us to get the first element, second element for each of the elements in the array until the array is over, and we'll explain this later as we see more things. Just a quick example. This is just going to loop through each element of the array, and we have to introduce arrays in the array section. And it'll do the same thing like for loop. And as long as you close that out with a curly brace, this is going to have valid code here. And the array at the top, you can just play around with it. Simple array. We have a variable here, and then we have the array keyword, and then this is just going to have 4 elements in the array. And we'll explain that when we get to the array section. But for each is very, very powerful, and it works similarly to the for, except it just has the different there. The difference in the syntax, and this is based off of an array. Very close. So you can play with this as you need to. It's very nice to be able to do that, and you can do so many powerful things.